How to make a live hand sack puppet.
To the puppet nerds of the world, this may sound absurd, but this is the place you need to be. We'll do an interview and then we'll stitch and glue all of the dolls, we'll make it shake. If you wanna be in the know and to play like a pro, subscribe to Puppet Nerd.
Welcome back, puppet nerds. Adam Krutinger here, and today we're going to learn how to make a live hand sack puppet. Now, you might be wondering, what is a sack puppet? A sack puppet is a form of live hand puppet. Live hand puppets are puppets that have gloves for hands. A lot of puppets, like my little monkey Arlo here, they have small hands that are on little rods. These rods are little sticks that allow you to control the arm movement of the puppet. Something that's nice about using rodded hands like this is you can kind of move two arms at once. And it allows the hands to be very tiny if you have a small character. But with a live hand puppet, the puppet's hands are like a glove. So your actual hand slides inside of it. You see, with this puppet, he has separate arms on each side of his body. And as you can see, inside of this hand is my hand because it just pretty much acts as a glove. Typically for a live hand puppet, your arm enters down at the elbow, like this. And if we put the right framing on the puppet, the hands are right down near the bottom of the frame, so it looks normal. And a lot of famous puppets work this way. The most obvious example I can think of right now is Fozzie Bear. He is a live hand puppet. But there is another kind of live hand puppet called a sack puppet. Unlike the regular live hand puppet, which has an entrance at each elbow and one in the center to go through to the puppet's head, these have only one giant entrance at the bottom. The entire body is literally like a sack, kind of like a big bag. And there's pretty much nothing in the bodies, which makes them pack up pretty small, which can be convenient. So as you can see, there's only one big hole where we enter both the head and the hands of the puppet, just like this. One thing that's nice about this is it can make the puppet seem a lot bigger. A lot more volume is filled up by having this be one piece. And another nice feature is that they're kind of easier to make. It's less pieces and less work and less foam when you have a puppet whose body is a sack. But to actually perform a sack puppet completely, you'll need two puppeteers. Since people only have two hands, typically with a sack puppet, one hand goes up into the head and your other hand goes into one of the hands. That leaves this other hand dangling, which is actually fine for a lot of shots. A lot of times, even in TV shows, they'll just pin the other arm to the body if it's not being used. That's what they also did on Avenue Q on Broadway, and I've done it in a lot of things myself, especially for walk-around shows live. But in order to operate that hand completely, again, you need a second puppeteer to come in just to do that hand. I don't have another puppeteer with me today, so I'm just gonna stick it onto this pole right here. So now you can see, just by filling out the puppet completely, look at the size of it. It really makes this puppet seem larger than life. So depending on what you're doing, you might do this puppet by yourself or you might use a second puppeteer. And if the puppet needs to do something that's extremely coordinated, like maybe playing drums or something, they'll actually have the other puppeteer do both hands and the main person doing the voice will only do the head. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Now today I'm going to show you exactly how I made this puppet right here. On this channel, I have a ton of different videos that teach you how to make your own pattern, which I encourage you to do. There's a lot of learning involved in making patterns. However, if you want to save time and help support this channel, you can download the Big Mack pattern from my website, puppetnerd.com. There's a printable PDF with all the pattern pieces. It also has a lining pattern that comes with it, as well as an alternative pattern for the hand that has 5 fingers. Because as we know, most puppets only have 4 fingers. And today I'm doing the 4-finger too. So anyway, I've got all my supplies. Let's get started. Today I'm going to be using this blue fur. Now most fur has a nap direction that the fur is flowing in. Right now I have this oriented up. When you cut out your pieces, you want to make sure you have a consistent nap direction. It should be going up or down. My preference is up. When the nap is all going down, your puppet will look very clean looking. And the fur is very easy to maintain to look nice. But if you have the nap going up, it makes it look more scraggly and monstery because the direction is fighting gravity. So for most of my monsters, I like to have it going up. And that's what I'm going to do today too. Now even though these pattern pieces are separate, if your fur is big big enough, you can actually just lay these pieces next to each other, and that's going to save you a whole bunch of sewing. But if you're piecing it together with smaller sections of fur, then you're going to want to use the pattern pieces as they come. Just a little tip for saving you some time. I decided to go with the 4-finger option, and I'm going to start tracing out the back half of the puppet right now. So I'm going to start cutting out the pieces, and what I do is I leave about a 1/4 inch of seam allowance along the edges so I can stitch it on the sewing machine really quick. However, up here around the fingers, I do stitch from about here all the way around the fingers to about here. I stitch that by hand. And since I stitch that by hand, this section I cut out directly on the line. So I'll do that right now. So right there, it's right on the line, and then I come over a little bit and leave that seam allowance. So this is the back piece, and now I'll trace and cut out the front. Now here is the front piece. You can tell because it curves down here, and I'm using the exact same arm piece. All right, here's the back. I'm going to put that with the fur side up. And here is the front. I'm going to lay on top of it so that all the fur is sandwiched inside. And what I'm going to start doing is pinning around the edges. But first I'm going to start with the fingers to make sure that they all line up perfectly. There we go, it's all pinned up. First thing I'm going to do is hand stitch around the fingers, and then we'll bring it over to the sewing machine. So I just knotted it, and I'm going to do a really tight whip stitch all the way around each of these fingers. It's going to take a while, but it's well worth it, and will make the fingers a little bit stronger. If you click right here, you can actually see a whole video on the best stitches to use for your puppet. So there we go, we have our hands all stitched up. Next I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch up the insides here and the outside edges on the sewing machine. There it is. Now it's all stitched up, and I'm just going to turn it inside out. And there we have it. This is the body of our live hand sack puppet. Now the head, of course, is going to go here, and that hand is just hanging like we mentioned earlier. You'll need a second performer for that, or you can just stuff it and pin it to the body like this. Now some of these details are a little bit difficult to see. These hands just seem like fluff balls right now. But after the whole puppet is put together, we're going to do a little bit of grooming so we can get these fingers looking really nice. Now let's move on to the foam head. Okay, so here's the foam head pattern, and I'm going to use some L200 foam to cut it out of. This is my favorite foam to use for monsters, and the kind I use the most is a 1/2 inch thick. So let's trace out this pattern. So make sure to mark which side is the front. It says right on the pattern, and to represent that I just put a little notch on the pieces. So now let me cut this out. So now I'm going to glue these pieces together using contact cement. But you could also use hot glue. If you do use contact cement, make sure to do it in a well-ventilated area and use a respirator. And if you click right here, I have a whole video on how to use contact cement too. So now that it's all tacky, I'm going to stick it together just like this. Be sure to match up the edges. And make sure that that top seam lines up too. Now I put these notches just to represent where the front is so I don't forget. Now we have to get into making the mouth plate. Now if you've ever built a puppet from this channel before, you know that I like to use storage bins for my mouth plates. And not just the lid too, I do actually use the whole bin. These types of bins are really cheap, like $5, and you can get tons of mouth plates out of them. If you're making little snoofs, you can get as many as like 50 mouth plates. Now you can use this plastic for this puppet too, but since the mouth plate is so wide on this, I like to use something with a little bit more structure. And for that, I like to use an 1/8 inch sheet of plywood. Again, it's just my preference for this puppet. Now let's trace it out. There we go, it's all traced out. Now let me cut it out with a saw. There we go, 2 mouth plates. Now I'm gonna hit them with some sandpaper. So there you go. Now it's nice and smooth and the glue's gonna take to it even better. Now I'm gonna make sure I find the front and the side notches, which are right in the middle on the ends right there. So I'm gonna glue the top mouth plate to the foam skull. Let that get tacky for a moment. There we go, now it's pretty tacky, so I'm gonna line up those notches and attach it just like this. Now there I have it, the top half of my head, and this is the bottom mouth plate here. Now the pattern does come with a foam jaw for the bottom half of the mouth too, but to be perfectly honest, I almost never use it. I kind of like to just have the fabric hang. And because of the shape of the pattern, it kind of creates a nice natural chin anyway. However, for completeness of the pattern, I am going to use it today. So let's trace out these pieces. Now on the pattern piece, it says which side is the center front, and it happens to be the side that's a little bit wider here. So I'm going to glue those 2 edges together just like this. There we go. So now it's pretty tacky, so I will attach it just like this. Be sure to line up the top and bottoms. And now this is going to get attached to the bottom of the chin like this. So let me get some more glue. It's pretty tacky again, so make sure to line up the center seam with the center front of the mouth plate piece like that, and then we will attach it just like this. And there we go. So that is pretty much our head. However, one thing that a lot of people like to add are different types of mouth grips. If you click right here, I have a whole video on different types of mouth grips. Some of them are finger loops, others are a band, and my personal favorite, which I'm gonna do today, is what I call the head plug. It's kind of like putting a foam brain into your puppet. It gives something for the back of your hand to rest against, so it's easier to manipulate. Let's make one right now. So to make the head plug, I'm gonna use some of this scrap foam here. This is a 1-inch reticulated foam, but you could pretty much use any scrap foam that you have. So what I'm going to do is take the head here and trace it just like this. I make sure to notch the front and the back. And then I want to trace in the thickness of the foam and maybe even just a little bit more. So I go in about maybe 3/4 of an inch, just like this, all the way around. You could measure it, but I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm just going to extend these notches here into the head, and then I'll cut it out. There we go. Now you could just glue this into the head like that, but I like to give this a little bit of lining. That'll make it last a little bit longer and make it a little bit more comfortable. Now you could use any fabric you want for lining, but I'm just going to use this piece of black cloth. Sometimes I'll use satin or lining material or even jersey. Pretty much anything that's just lying around. But I'm going to glue this down. I'm gonna let that get tacky for a moment, and then I'll glue it down like this. And then I wanna wrap this so that I hit the edges as well. So I'm gonna add a little bit more glue, and I'll let that sit for another minute. And then all I'll do is just kind of fold it up, just like this, all the way around. Almost like the way a Hershey Kiss is wrapped. And we have a good connection. Now you could just leave all this scrap fabric here. It would kind of act as stuffing inside the head, or you can trim it off to clean it up. Today I'm gonna trim it off. And there we go, we have a nice little head plug. Now I'm gonna glue it into the puppet's head. I'll put some glue along this edge, all the way around. And around the inside of the head. Now, since it's such a tight fit, I don't want to wait too long for it to get too tacky. So I'm going to do a little bit of a wet fit and slide it in just like this. There we go. That's really comfortable. In the meantime, one thing you can do too is add a little bit of a thumb strap here for the bottom of the mouth plate if you want to. And for that, I'm just going to use a little piece of scrap foam here. This piece happens to be about 5 inches wide, and I think that should do well. So I'll put a little bit of glue in there and on here, and have a nice little sheath for my thumb. Sometimes I use a heat gun to help speed up the drying process a little bit. I'll gently put it in there and kind of wrap it around my thumb. I got a nice little spot for your thumb. And now with those grips in there, we have a head that's much easier to manipulate and hold. And now it's time for the fabric head cover. So I have my fur out again, and I'm going to trace this head pattern twice, and I'm going to flip it on the mirror edge like this to cut out 2 copies of it. But again, make sure that fur direction is going the way that you want it to. Now here's the thing when you come to cutting it out. If you want to stitch it on the sewing machine, make sure to leave a seam allowance like we did before. But if you're going to sew it by hand, you can go ahead and cut right on the line. Today I'm going to use a sewing machine. And there we go. So next I'm going to start pinning these together. First thing I want to do is close up the dart on the top of the head. Okay, and then I'll stitch these together on the sewing machine. Okay, so I just stitched those top darts together, and now I'm going to put these 2 heads together side by side, just like this. And now I'm going to stitch all the way from the tip of the nose here down to the back of the neck, and then from the bottom of the neck to the tip of the chin. Again, be sure not to sew the mouth shut or the neck hole shut. Let me pin this up first. Be sure to line up the darts. Now I'm going to go stitch it up on the machine. So there it is, all stitched up. Only thing I did is I left about 4 or 5 inches at the back open still. That's going to make this whole thing easier to turn inside out once we add the foam head. Okay, now that we have the head all stitched up, I want to cut out the fabric mouth plate too. For that, I'm going to use some of this red stretch velvet. It has a really nice look, but you could use felt or any kind of fabric you really want. So I'm going to go ahead and trace out the pattern. Now, depending on the look that you want and how you're gonna stitch it, you might wanna add some seam allowance. If you're stitching on a sewing machine and want a little bit of a fur lip on the inside, leave no seam allowance. But if you're using a sewing machine and you want the mouth plate to go straight to the edge, then you should add some seam allowance. If you're sewing by hand and you want it to go right to the edge, don't add any seam allowance at all. And if you're sewing by hand and you want a little bit of lip on the inside, then you're actually gonna cut away a little bit of the fabric. Maybe just like a 1/4 inch or so. Today I'm gonna stitch it on the sewing machine and I want just a little bit of a lip. So I'm gonna add just a tiny bit of seam allowance. I'm gonna cut it out right now. There we go. So now I'm gonna pin the fabric mouth plate into the fur head covering. Be sure to line up the notches. There we go, it's all pinned up. Now let's stitch it on the sewing machine. There we go, it's all stitched in. Now what I'm going to do is to glue the jaw and the top of the head into this fabric covering. And to do that, I'm going to use contact cement. Now, I used to spray the whole thing with like spray adhesive on both ends and then attach it. But I found that made the puppet a little bit too stiff. So all I do is put a little bit of glue around the edges right here and around the edge of the mouth too, and then stick it in. You don't need to cover the entire thing with glue. So let me do that right now. You really don't want to use too much glue here either, or else it could soak through into the mouthplate fabric. And then you might have like a little wet spot stain on the inside, which would not be good. And then some glue right around the inside of the mouth. Make sure you put the top on the top and the bottom on the bottom. And do your best to line up the notches too. There we go, all attached. Now I have to carefully turn it inside out. That's why it helped having that little piece unsewn on the back. And there we go, we have a nice little puppet head. Now that I have the covering on the head, I'm gonna stitch up this last couple inches on the back here. Again, make sure to leave the whole neck hole open. You're just closing up this last little bit we left open, which made it easier to put this whole slip cover on. All right, there we go. Now that's all stitched up and ready to go. So now we have our body finished and our head. Now it's time to connect them together. Now you want to make sure you get the body going the right way because there is a front and back. You'll remember that the back goes up a little bit higher than in the front, kind of like a t-shirt does too. And you'll want to make sure you line up the center front notch with the center front notch beneath the chin on the head and the center back notch with the center back notch on the head right there. So what I'm going to do is gently pin the front notches together just like this. And then I'll actually turn this inside out to get to the inside. Should make it a little bit easier to reach the back. There we go, there's our back center. And now I have to find the back center seam on the head. There it is, it's easy to tell because it's a stitched line. So I'll pin that. And now that I have the front and back pinned together, it's very simple to just evenly pin the rest of the circumference of the neck. There we go, it's all pinned up. So now what I'm going to do is stitch all the way around. For this, I'm going to stitch it by hand and just use a simple whip stitch. Now you could stop here and just start adding some details to your puppet. There's one more thing that you can add that's completely optional, and that is hooping for your puppet. What that is, it's kind of like a little bit of a frame for your puppet. If you've ever seen big puffy dresses, what they actually have on the inside is a special hooping. Typically made out of spring steel, it's something that gives the whole dress its form. Now, not all sack puppets have this. However, it can be kind of handy. And if you click right here, I actually did a whole video all about hooping for your puppets. It gets a little bit more into depth there. And it also shows a couple different ways on how to add it to your puppet. So since there's already a dedicated video, I'm just gonna kind of speed through it right now. I'm gonna go ahead, trace out the patterns. There we go, and I'm going to pin it up and stitch it. All right, there's the lining all stitched up. Now what I'm going to do is add the casing, so I'm going to use some twill tape for the casing this time. There we go. Now I have the twill tape added on. Now what I'm going to do is add in the boning. I'm going to use some of this hooping right here. And there it is. And what I'm going to do next is put it inside of this puppet. Just like the fur pieces, there's a back and a front. The higher part is in the back and the lower part is in the front. So you want to match up those notches as well, and you want to stitch it in the exact same spot where we just stitched the head on. But for right now, for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to safety pin it on. And just like that, you can tell already that the body is filled out a little bit nicer. At this point, the puppet can be done. You can just add some eyes on, but first I want to show you some grooming techniques. By trimming back the fur in certain places, it can make your puppet much easier to read and to see on camera, especially things like the fingers and around the mouth. My favorite tool to trim puppets is just to use scissors. I know some people like to use like electric razors, but I don't really like the look of it, and it kind of makes it look too perfect. Especially for a monster-like character like this, I want him to look a little tangled and scraggly. So I'm going to start trimming around the face first. There we go. Looks pretty good. Now let's add some features. For today, I'm just putting on some simple eyes, but I've got a whole bunch of different videos on eyes. Everything from making your own simple eyes, to googly eyes that shake around like this, and even eyebrow mechanisms. So be sure to check those out. And there we go. He's looking like a pretty fun little monster. Oh yeah. Maybe we'll add a little nose too.
Hey, I'm a friendly monster. You don't have to worry.
And here he is. Who doesn't love a fluffy little monster? These types of puppets are so much fun to perform. And another thing that's pretty nice about them is even though they play really big, here he's on a stand now. Let me put my hands in him so you can see how big he is. So So now you can see how big this puppet can play, especially with 2 people operating it. Again, one person doing the head and an arm, and another person doing the other hand. It can play really big. But the other thing that's really nice about it is a puppet like this can pretty much roll up into a little backpack, which makes a puppet like this very easy to transport. And you don't have to worry about arm rods poking out or getting bent. And to help protect the face and eyes from getting scratched, you can kind of turn this whole puppet inside out. It's just another way to protect your puppet during travel. And again, for today, we went with a very simple design. But your options for designing this character are limitless. It could have a really big lip. You could give it a bunch of big hair, different eyes. You could give it googly eyes, an eyebrow mechanism. Really, your options are limitless. And I can't wait to see what you come up with. If you try out this pattern, I would love to see it. Make sure to tag me in any pictures you post, or even process photos too. And if this seems a little bit too complex, I have a whole bunch of more simple patterns you can use too. And all of those are free on my website, puppetnerd.com. And if you want to learn even more about how to get started in making your own puppet show, check out Puppetry 101. That's going to show you all the ins and outs on how to get started. Anyway, that's it for now. We'll see you next time.